The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, I was standing on a train platform I swore I would never see again. My name is Theo Ashford, and until 3 days ago, I hadn't set foot in Marrow's Edge in 6 years. The town smelled the same as I remembered, salt and wet stone and the particular sweetness of the bakery on Harbor Street that never changed its recipe no matter how many decades passed. I hated how comforting it felt. I hated it because comfort was the last thing I deserved here. My father had died 2 weeks earlier. A heart attack, the doctor said, quick and painless, though I doubted anything about dying alone in a lighthouse could truly be painless. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the argument that sent me running to the city with nothing but a duffel bag and a decision I never let myself regret out loud. Now his lawyer had called to tell me I'd inherited the lighthouse, the little keeper's cottage beside it, and a stack of unpaid debts that made my stomach turn. I came back to sell it. That was the plan. Sign some papers, hire an agent, disappear again before the town could ask too many questions about where I'd been or why I never called. I did not expect to find someone already living there. The cottage door was unlocked when I arrived, which struck me as strange until I saw the boots by the entrance. Worn leather, salt-stained, definitely not my father's size. I remember standing in the doorway, keys still in my hand, feeling a spike of anger so sharp it surprised me. Someone had moved into my father's house before his body was even cold in the ground. "Can I help you?" The voice came from the kitchen, low and even, carrying the kind of calm that instantly made me feel unreasonable for my anger. I turned to find a man leaning against the counter, drying a mug with a dish towel like he'd done it 1,000 times in that exact spot. He was tall, with dark hair that curled slightly at his neck, and eyes the color of the sea outside on an overcast day, gray, but not cold. He looked at me the way you'd look at a stray cat that had wandered somewhere it didn't belong, careful, unsure whether to approach or wait. "This is my house," I said, sharper than I intended. Something flickered across his face. Not fear, not quite guilt either. Recognition, maybe. "You're Theo." It wasn't a question. Robert's son. Hearing my father's first name from a stranger's mouth in my father's kitchen made something twist painfully behind my ribs. "Who are you?" "Julian." He set the mug down carefully, like he needed something to do with his hands. "Julian Reyes. I've been keeping the light for your father the last 2 years. His hip was bad. He couldn't climb the tower stairs anymore, so He stopped himself, seeming to realize how strange this must look. "I live in the back room. He never charged me rent. I helped him instead." I didn't know what to say to that. 6 years of silence, and my father had let a stranger into his home, into his life, into the lighthouse that used to be the one place we didn't fight. The lighthouse where he taught me to read the tide charts when I was 7 years old, where we ate dinner in silence some nights because words felt too heavy, but silence with him had never felt lonely. Not until it did. "I'm selling it," I said. The words came out colder than I meant them to, a shield I didn't realize I still needed after all these years. Julian's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders seemed to drop, just slightly, like he'd been expecting this and hoping he was wrong. "The town needs that light, Theo. There's no automated system out here. The currents around Marrow's Edge are too unpredictable for satellite guidance alone. Fishing boats still depend on someone manually checking the lamp every night. That's not my problem. It was your father's problem for 30 years. The words landed harder than he probably intended, and I saw him wince slightly, like he regretted saying them the moment they left his mouth. I should have walked away then. I should have found a hotel in town and let the lawyers handle everything without ever speaking to this man again. Instead, I stood there in my father's kitchen, gripping keys that suddenly felt too heavy in my hand, and said nothing at all. Julian broke the silence first. "You can stay in your old room. I'll keep to the back. We don't have to." He paused, searching for the right words. "We don't have to be friends. But I'd like to explain some things about your father, if you'll let me. Things he never got the chance to tell you himself." I should have said no. Every instinct told me to say no. "Fine," I said instead. "One night. Then I'm calling the estate agent." He nodded slowly, like he already knew one night would become more than that. I didn't understand yet why he looked so certain. I wouldn't understand for weeks. That first night, I couldn't sleep. My old room hadn't changed. The same faded blue wallpaper, the same shelf of seashells I'd collected as a kid, the same window facing the lighthouse tower that blinked its slow, patient rhythm across the dark water. I lay there listening to unfamiliar footsteps in a familiar house, and somewhere close to midnight, I heard the back door open and close. I found Julian standing at the base of the lighthouse, staring up at the tower with a look I couldn't quite name. Worry maybe, or grief, though I didn't understand yet why a stranger would grieve my father the way I couldn't seem to. "I have to check the lamp," he said without turning around, like he'd known I was there before I made a sound. "Every night at midnight. Your father was very particular about it." I remember. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. He glanced at me then, surprised, like he hadn't expected me to admit to remembering anything good about this place. "You used to come up with him when you were young. A long time ago. Do you want to come up now?" I don't know why I said yes. Maybe it was exhaustion, or grief I hadn't let myself feel yet, or the strange gravity of a man who spoke about my father with more warmth than I'd shown him in years. I followed Julian up the spiral stairs, our footsteps echoing off cold stone, until we reached the lamp room at the top, glass windows wrapping around us in every direction, the whole dark ocean spread out like something that had been waiting for us. "He talked about you," Julian said quietly, adjusting something in the mechanism with practiced hands. "More than you'd think. He kept every letter you never sent." My chest tightened. I didn't send any letters. "I know." Julian looked at me then, really looked, in a way that made me feel seen in a manner I wasn't prepared for. "He wrote them anyway, kept them in a drawer in his room. I think he was waiting for the courage to send them, or for you to come home first so he wouldn't have to." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I stood there in the lamp room with a stranger who somehow knew more about my father's heart than I did, and I felt something crack open inside my chest that I'd spent 6 years carefully sealing shut. "I'm sorry," Julian said softly. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine." It wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. We stood in silence after that, watching the lights sweep across the water in its slow, hypnotic rhythm, and for reasons I couldn't explain, the silence with Julian didn't feel unbearable the way I expected it to. It felt, strangely, like something I hadn't realized I was missing. Before I went back down, Julian said one more thing, so quiet I almost missed it over the sound of the wind against the glass. "The letters are still in his drawer, if you want them." I never opened them. They weren't mine to open. I didn't answer. I went back to my old room and lay awake until dawn, staring at a ceiling I used to know every crack of, thinking about a father I never properly said goodbye to, and a stranger who seemed to be holding pieces of him I never knew existed. I told myself I would leave in the morning. I did not leave in the morning. I stayed for the letters. That's what I told myself. Anyway, on the morning I called the estate agent and asked her to give me 2 more weeks before listing the property. She sounded surprised. I didn't blame her. I was surprised too. The truth was more complicated than letters, though I wasn't ready to admit that yet. Julian and I settled into an unspoken rhythm over those first few days. He'd wake early to check the weather reports, moving through the cottage with a quiet efficiency that made it clear he'd lived there long enough to know every creaking floorboard and every drafty window. I found myself watching him sometimes, without meaning to, the careful way he handled the old lighthouse equipment, like it was something precious rather than just machinery, the way he hummed old sailing songs under his breath while making coffee, off-key, but somehow pleasant to listen to. I read my father's letters one at a time, unable to manage more than one a day without needing to walk along the shore afterward to clear my head. They were not accusatory, the way I expected. They were gentle, regretful. My father wrote about missing my mother's laugh, about wishing he'd been softer with me when I was young, about hoping that wherever I was happy, even if that happiness didn't include him. One evening, after reading a particularly difficult letter, I found myself at the base of the lighthouse again, this time without needing Julian to lead me there. "Rough one today?" he asked, appearing beside me with 2 mugs of tea, handing one over without waiting for me to answer. "He wrote about the day I left," I said, staring at the water instead of at him. "He said he understood why I was angry. He said he wished he'd told me that in person instead of just letting me walk away." Julian was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to talk about why you left?" "You don't have to. I feel like I'm getting pieces of a story you haven't told me the middle of." I almost said no. 6 years of practiced deflection nearly won out. But something about the lighthouse, the tea, the quiet patience in Julian's voice made the words come easier than they had in years. My mother died when I was 22, I said. Cancer. It was slow, and it was awful, and my father shut down completely. He stopped talking about her. Stopped talking, period, really. I needed him to grieve with me. And instead, he just disappeared into this lighthouse, into his routines, like if he didn't stop moving, he wouldn't have to feel anything. I told him he was a coward. I told him I couldn't watch him pretend everything was fine when nothing was fine. And then I left, and I never came back, because leaving felt easier than watching him not feel anything at all. Julian didn't say anything right away, which I appreciated more than I could explain. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle in a way that made my throat tight. I think grief makes people strange sometimes. Not because they don't feel it, but because they feel it too much and don't know where to put it. He paused. I lost someone too. A few years back. My brother, in a boating accident, not far from these waters actually. I understand a little of what it does to a person, watching someone try to survive something that big. I'm sorry, I said and meant it. It's part of why I came here, actually. After it happened, I couldn't be near the ocean without falling apart. A friend told me about an old lighthouse keeper looking for help, someone who understood tides and currents. I thought maybe if I faced the water instead of running from it, I could learn to survive being near it again. He looked at me sideways, something soft and vulnerable in his expression that I hadn't seen from him before. Your father helped me more than he probably realized. He never asked me to talk about it if I didn't want to. He just let me exist here, quietly, until I remembered how to breathe around the ocean again. I felt something shift in my chest, a piece of resentment I'd been carrying for years quietly rearranging itself into something closer to understanding. My father hadn't been running from feeling. He'd been trying, in his own broken way, to survive it, the same way Julian had been trying to survive his own grief in this very cottage. Thank you, I said quietly, for being here for him, even if I couldn't be. Julian's hand found mine on the railing, just briefly, just enough to feel the warmth of his palm against my knuckles before he pulled back like he wasn't sure if the gesture was welcome. He would have wanted you here eventually. I really believe that. I didn't pull my hand away fast enough to pretend the touch hadn't affected me. The days that followed blurred together in a way that surprised me. Mornings spent reading letters. Afternoons walking the shoreline with Julian while he pointed out things about the coast I'd forgotten from childhood. Which tide pools held the best shells, which rocks were dangerous to climb during high tide, which stretch of beach my father used to walk every evening after my mother passed, alone, thinking thoughts he never shared with anyone. Evenings became my favorite part, though I didn't admit that to myself for a while. Julian and I would sit on the porch after his lamp check, sharing whatever dinner one of us had managed to cook, talking about things that felt increasingly personal, favorite books, childhood fears, the strange specific loneliness of loving someone you'd lost. It was on one of these evenings, nearly 2 weeks into my stay, that I realized the feeling building in my chest wasn't simply gratitude toward a stranger who'd cared for my father. It was something warmer, something that made my pulse quicken every time Julian laughed at something I said, something that made me notice the exact shade of gray his eyes turned when the sunset hit the water just right. You're staring, Julian said, amusement flickering in his voice, though he didn't look away from the horizon. Sorry. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Just thinking. About. I hesitated. 6 years of guarding my heart carefully didn't disappear just because a kind stranger with sea-gray eyes had slowly, patiently, dismantled every wall I'd built. But something about the honesty of the past 2 weeks made me want to try, just this once, to say something true instead of something safe. About how strange it is, I said slowly, that I came here to sell a building I hated, and instead I found someone who makes me want to stay. Julian turned to look at me then, surprise softening into something more careful, more hopeful. Theo, I'm not saying it to pressure you into anything, I said quickly, suddenly nervous. I needed you to know. In case it changes anything. In case it doesn't. For a long moment, Julian said nothing, and I felt my heart sink, certain I'd misread everything, certain I'd ruined the fragile, easy friendship we'd built over 2 short weeks. Then he reached over and took my hand again, this time without pulling away. It changes something, he said quietly. It changes a lot, actually. I just wasn't sure you felt the same. I didn't want to say anything and make you feel like you had to stay here for reasons you weren't ready for. Relief and something warmer flooded through me all at once. I don't know what I'm ready for, I admitted. I know I'm not ready to sell this place anymore. And I know I'm not ready to leave. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. Julian's thumb brushed gently across my knuckles, and the simple touch felt like more intimacy than I'd allowed myself in years. Then maybe we don't have to figure out everything tonight. Maybe we just take it slow. See where it goes. I'd like that, I whispered. We sat there until the sun disappeared completely, hands intertwined, the lighthouse behind us beginning its nightly rhythm of light and shadow across the water, and for the first time since my father's death, I felt something close to peace. But peace, I would learn very soon, rarely lasts as long as we hope it will. 3 days later, everything changed. I was in my father's study, going through the last of his paperwork before deciding whether to keep the lighthouse or find a way to sell it while still preserving what it meant to the town, when I found a folder I hadn't seen before. Inside were medical documents, Julian's name at the top, dates going back nearly a year, terminology I didn't fully understand but recognized enough to feel my stomach drop. I found Julian on the widow's walk that evening, staring at the water with the same haunted expression I'd seen the very first night we met. You know, he said quietly, before I could even ask. He must have seen my face, must have known immediately what I'd found. Julian, it's a heart condition, he said, still not looking at me. Something I've had since the accident that killed my brother. The same accident, actually. I was injured too, more seriously than anyone realized until symptoms started showing up months later. The doctors say it's manageable, mostly, but there are risks, especially with stress, especially with. He stopped, swallowing hard. Your father knew. He was the only person I told, besides my doctors. He said he understood what it was like, loving someone while being afraid every day that you might lose them too soon. My chest ached with a fear I wasn't prepared for. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me right now. His voice cracked slightly, like I'm something fragile, like I'm already gone. Julian, I didn't know what to say. 2 weeks of careful, patient falling, and now this fear sitting heavy in my chest, threatening everything we'd only just begun building. I understand if this changes things, Julian said quietly, finally turning to face me, eyes glistening in the fading light. I understand if it's too much to ask someone to fall for a person who might not have as much time as they deserve. I closed the distance between us before he could finish the thought, taking his face gently in my hands, forcing him to look at me instead of the water. It doesn't change anything, I said firmly, though my voice shook. It just means I want every single day we get, however many that turns out to be. It doesn't make me want to run. It makes me want to stay closer. Julian's eyes filled with tears he clearly hadn't expected to cry, and when I pulled him into an embrace, I felt him tremble slightly against me, like he'd been holding his breath for a very long time, waiting for someone to prove they wouldn't leave the moment things became complicated. Thank you, he whispered against my shoulder. For staying. For not running. I'm not going anywhere. I promised, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in years. But that night, as I held him under the lighthouse's steady glow, I couldn't ignore the fear settling deep in my chest. The fear that I'd finally found something worth staying for, only to face the possibility of losing it before I'd even had the chance to fully hold on. The weeks following that conversation were some of the most tender and terrifying of my life. Tender, because Julian and I finally allowed ourselves to be fully honest with each other, sharing not just our hopes, but our fears, building something real out of two broken hearts learning to trust again. Terrifying, because every time Julian climbed the lighthouse stairs a little slower than usual, or pressed his hand briefly against his chest during a long walk, I felt the fragile nature of what we were building settle heavy in my bones. I threw myself into research, reading everything I could find about his condition, accompanying him to appointments with a specialist 2 towns over, learning the names of medications and the warning signs I should watch for. Julian protested at first, insisting he didn't want me to treat him like something breakable. I'm not trying to treat you like you're breakable, I told him one afternoon, sitting beside him in the specialist's waiting room. I'm trying to learn how to love you properly. That means understanding all of you, not just the parts that are easy. He'd gone quiet at that, gripping my hand a little tighter, and I felt something settle between us, an understanding that love, real love, meant showing up for the hard parts too, not just the easy evenings on the porch watching sunsets. We decided together, eventually, that I would keep the lighthouse. Not to sell, not to walk away from, but to properly restore, working alongside Julian to modernize just enough of the old mechanisms to make the nightly checks less physically demanding, while preserving everything that made the place matter to the town and to my father's memory. It felt, in a strange way, like finally finishing a conversation my father and I never got to have, proving to him, even though he couldn't hear it anymore, that I understood now why he stayed. One evening, nearly 2 months after I'd first arrived intending to stay only a single night, Julian asked me to meet him at the top of the lighthouse just before sunset. I found him standing by the great glass windows, the whole sky beginning to turn shades of orange and pink behind him, and something about the way he was looking at me made my heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I want to tell you something," he said, taking my hands in his. "When your father first hired me, I told him I didn't think I'd ever feel steady again. Too much loss, too much fear about my own heart giving out the way it almost did during the accident. He told me something I've thought about every single day since." "What did he say?" I asked softly. "He said the ocean doesn't stop being dangerous just because you learn to love it, but you can learn to trust the light that guides you through the dangerous parts." He wasn't just talking about the lighthouse. Julian's eyes were glassy with emotion, his voice steady despite it. I think he was talking about people. About learning to trust someone again after loss teaches you to be afraid of trusting anything. I felt tears building in my own eyes, understanding exactly what he meant, exactly what my father had somehow known even in his own grief and isolation. "You're my light, Theo," Julian said quietly. "Not because you fixed me or saved me from anything, but because you stayed, even when staying was scary, even when you found out about my heart and could have easily walked away. I'll always stay. I promised," my voice breaking slightly with the weight of the emotion building in my chest. "However many sunrises we get, I want every single one of them to be with you." Julian leaned forward slowly, giving me every chance to pull away if I wanted to, but I didn't want to. When our lips finally met, soft and warm and achingly gentle, it felt like every fear I'd carried since arriving in Mara's Edge finally settled into something like peace. It wasn't a kiss born of desperation or fear. It was a promise, quiet and certain, of two people choosing each other despite every uncertainty the future might hold. When we finally pulled back, foreheads resting together, Julian laughed softly, the sound warm and full of relief. "I've wanted to do that since the night I found you standing at the base of this lighthouse looking like you wanted to run and stay at the same time." "I'm glad you waited," I whispered. "I'm glad you stayed," he answered. 6 months later, the lighthouse still stands at Mara's Edge, its light sweeping steadily across the water every single night, guiding fishing boats safely home the way it has for over 30 years. Julian's health has remained stable, carefully managed, monitored closely, but stable, enough that we've allowed ourselves to imagine a future together we once weren't sure we'd get to have. I still read my father's letters sometimes, on quiet evenings when the memories feel close enough to hold. I understand him now in ways I couldn't before. The way grief can make a person retreat instead of reaching out. The way love sometimes looks like silence instead of grand gestures. The way a lighthouse keeper spends his whole life making sure others find their way home safely, even while quietly losing his own way in the process. Julian and I have settled into a life neither of us expected, but both of us treasure deeply. Mornings spent maintaining the tower together, afternoons walking the same shoreline where we first began to fall for each other, evenings on the porch where conversation flows as easily as the tide against the rocks below. Last week, I found myself standing exactly where Julian had stood that very first night, staring up at the lighthouse with an expression I imagine mirrored the one he wore back then. He came up behind me quietly, wrapping his arms around me from behind, resting his chin gently on my shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About how strange life is," I answered, leaning back into his warmth. "I came here to close a door. Instead, I found the person who taught me how to open my heart again." Julian pressed a soft kiss against my temple. "Your father always said the ocean gives back what it takes, eventually, just not always in the way you expect." I turned in his arms to face him, taking in the soft gray of his eyes reflecting the lighthouse's steady glow, feeling grateful beyond words for a love I never saw coming. built slowly and carefully out of shared grief, patient honesty, and the quiet courage it takes to stay when staying feels frightening. I love you, I told him, the words easy now after months of practice, though they still carried the same weight and warmth as the very first time I'd said them. I love you too, Julian answered, smiling the smile that had slowly, steadily become my favorite thing in the entire world. Forever, however many sunrises that turns out to be. We stood together beneath the lighthouse as the sun set behind us, its beam beginning its nightly journey across the water, guiding lost ships home the same way it had guided two lost hearts back to each other. Thank you so much for reading The Lighthouse at Marrow's Edge. If you enjoyed Theo and Julian's slow burn journey, please give this story a like, subscribe for more heartfelt BL stories, and leave a comment below telling me your favorite moment from their story. Did you love The Lighthouse Confession? The Porch Conversations? Let me know. See you in the next story.